Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another New York Cannabis Licensing Bootcamp. Today, we're going to be focusing on licensing and compliance tips for the CAURD license, which is now live, as you may already know. For those of you who don't know, Vicente Cedarberg is a law firm that focuses exclusively on the cannabis, hemp, and psychedelics markets. The firm was founded in 2010, and we currently have offices in New York, Boston, Denver, Los Angeles, Florida, Michigan, and others. And the New York office launched in 2019. My name is Tim Callahan. I'm the Director of Licensing Northeast Region at Vicente Cedarberg. I've been with the firm since 2013. In that time, I've largely helped businesses apply for cannabis licenses in Massachusetts and many other markets, including New York now. Some would say that makes me a grizzled veteran in this industry, and I kind of feel that way physically and emotionally, frankly. I'm also joined by my colleagues, Casey Lever and Bridgette Nikisher, and I'll turn it over to Bridgette now before going over to Casey for quick bios.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Bridgette Nikisher, and I am a Strategic Affairs Specialist with Vicente Cedarberg. I do a ton of licensing and compliance work, as well as just general support for anything that anyone might need. I'm based out of the New York office, and I grew up in Westchester, so I'm super excited to see these licenses come online and very excited for everyone joining us today.
And I'm Casey Lever. I'm the Director of Regulatory Compliance for Vicente Cedarberg, covering our East Coast operations and licenses. I help all of our clients go from a piece of paper to an operational license, going through site plans, floor plans, and really considering compliance generally right from the outset, navigating licensing process, inspections with regulators, ongoing communication with regulators, and once you're open, staying open. So I'm very excited for the New York market and ready to see some licenses get going.
Thanks, Casey and Bridgette. Before we dive in, I just wanted to give some basic instructions to anybody unfamiliar with Zoom. There is a chat function and a Q&A function. And if you have any questions, please drop them into the Q&A function so we can kind of better keep track of those questions and give you a response. A copy of this PowerPoint is going to go out to anybody who registered, so don't feel like you have to take notes. You'll have a copy of this in your inbox. And also, just as a note, this information that we're providing during this presentation is based upon the CAURD regulations. Fortunately, we have those for this license type. OCM guidance and documents and FAQs, including the APCs. Some of the guidance is kind of from across license types to kind of flesh out some more context for things, and our experience navigating the portal, which, frankly, is just as of this morning, at least for this license type. And even though we have regulations for this license type, some of the guidance and understanding surrounding the application is in flux based on new guidance from OCM. And also as the application process evolves, this presentation is intended to be informational in nature and shouldn't be construed as legal advice. Now, just kind of getting into the actual presentation, we're going to go through some of the application materials, including eligibility requirements, required documentation, portal tips, and then ongoing compliance considerations. Please, next slide. So the regulations were adopted on August 3rd for the conditional adult use retail dispensary license types, the CAURD license types. There weren't any changes from the draft regulations, even though there were 650 comments received. You can see kind of some of the responses to those via the assessment of public comment, the APC. The application period for the CAURD licenses is live as of today and is going through September 26th. So it's honestly a pretty short window to be submitting these applications. So it's imperative that you get started on these applications, collecting all the information and documentation that you need today. You would register for an account via New York Business Express portal, and you can kind of navigate through that, save as you will, kind of add information, documentation as you have it. We really must emphasize people kind of familiarize themselves with that application before kind of getting started. And the OCM also has a mock-up of the application if you wanted to review that, as well as a multitude of other resources that are frankly very helpful for navigating the application itself, the disclosures within, and kind of understanding what the CAURD license process and the license itself entails. Okay, so in terms of eligibility requirements, you have to establish a significant presence in New York State, but also there are two primary ways to qualify for the license, and that's justice-involved individuals who own a qualifying business or through nonprofit. We're not going to focus on the nonprofit eligibility requirements just because the universe of eligible nonprofits is so small that would qualify for this license type. In terms of the application materials required, you have to prove a presence in New York State. And now for the applicant entity, you have to have significant presence, be incorporated or otherwise organized in the state, or majority of the owners must be residents physically present in the state, no less than 100 calendar days during the current year, or 540 calendar days over the course of 3 years. Also, the justice-involved individual who controls the license or will control the license must have a significant presence in New York State. That could be residency in New York State. That can be through assets like bank accounts or property held in New York State, or some other connection with or in New York State. Next slide, please. One of the requirements is proving justice-involved status, which is proof of marijuana-related arrest or conviction in New York State prior to March 31st, 2021. The easiest way to show proof of a marijuana-related conviction is to provide a certificate of disposition or a certified indictment. They'll also accept a multitude of other documentation, including record of judgment, record of plea, verdict and sentence, so on and so forth. We emphasize that people should review and provide as much documentation as they can in order to support the conviction. If you were arrested for a cannabis-related offense, an eligible cannabis-related offense, and then you pled down to a lesser offense, you might still be eligible for the CAURD license, although you'll have to provide sufficient documentation that evidences the cannabis-related offense that you were originally arrested for. Just more proof of justice-involved status for the arrest or conviction. When you're going through the application process, it's actually pretty neat in terms of checking off, how you qualify, both in terms of the underlying conviction and also the documentation that you're providing to it. So it's fairly clear in terms of like what you're providing in the portal and uploading, but it might take some time for you to gather all that information. We would recommend that people be as voluminous as possible in terms of establishing that documentation, as long as it's relevant. The clearer it is that you're convicted of an eligible offense, the better. You also have to prove residency at the time of conviction. That can be done a number of ways: valid New York State driver's license, state or federal tax filing or return, utility bills, credit card statements, leases, property tax statements, so on and so forth. And then other ways of proving residency include the ID NYC card. And as a note too, and I think we're going to get to this, it doesn't necessarily have to be you personally, the justice-involved individual was convicted of a crime. It can also be, parents, spouses, dependents, so on and so forth, which is kind of what we're getting at here in terms of who's arrested or convicted. If you have a familial relationship, whether that's, parent or spouse or dependent or a child, then you need to establish that connection in order to be eligible. That can be done through birth certificates, tax returns, school records, and other forms approved by the OCM. There's a multitude of guidance on that point anyway. One other prong in terms of the eligibility requirements is proving business ownership. So the individual who is the justice-involved individual must have control over the applicant and have at least 30% of the ownership. And they also, in addition to being justice-involved, they have to show qualifying business experience where they owned at least 10% of and control the qualifying business. And this could be any number of businesses, but you have to show that you also had profitability for at least 2 years in that business while you owned or controlled it. This can be done through like tax documents, through W-3s, insurance receipts, similar documents. One of the disclosure requirements for the application in terms of the people being added is true parties of interest. Every true party of interest has to include a personal history disclosure, which is available on OCM's website. They also have to include and upload a New York State Department of Tax and Finance clearance form. TPIs have to upload a photocopy of the front and back of a valid government issued photo ID, and all TPIs must consent to a criminal history background check. I would note that TPIs, people who qualify as a TPI, it also includes their spouses. And I would really urge people to very closely review who qualifies as a TPI and the disclosures related to that to make sure you're being as thorough as possible with your disclosures. And now I'm turning it over to Bridgette.
Thanks, Tim. So as Tim mentioned earlier, applications are live now on New York's Business Express portal. They are only open for 30 days, closing on September 26th. So something you can do if you're not necessarily ready to submit an application, or even if you are, is go ahead and go to OCM's website at cannabis.ny.gov, go to licensing, click on Conditional Adult Use Retail Dispensary, and they have a super helpful application mockup and other resources, FAQs, regulations, guidance, stuff like that. The application mockup is super helpful. It'll show you exactly what the portal looks like, and it just provides some good guidance as to what you're up against. So that Business Express portal is the first step. You want to register your entity for an account at businessexpress.ny.gov. You can do this at any point after your entity has been formed, but it is the portal that New York uses for everything. So we highly recommend that that is one of the first things you do. You can do it as soon as you form your entity and just store the password in a safe place so that you have access to it. The one thing to be aware of when you're making that account is to be sure that the contact email that you list is one of you or your partners, and it should be an email account that you check frequently. All correspondence from OCM is going to go to that email address, and you only have 30 days to remedy your application if there's something wrong with it. So you want to be sure that you're on top of that to address anything that you need to in a timely fashion. Just another thing to be aware of in the portal in general is that you can save and exit. So if you're not necessarily ready to submit a complete application, you can hop in the portal and populate it and save and then come back to it another point. But you can't move forward until you've completed the entire page. So it will tell you though that you're not complete, and it will prompt you to fill it in. If you're not necessarily ready, you can always put placeholders in, just type in ABC, upload a dummy document, something like that. And you can always move backwards. So you can't move forward until you completed it, but you can always go backwards. Another thing to be aware of is that the portal has a size limit. So if you're uploading huge amounts of corporate documents, you might have to upload a reduced size PDF. Unfortunately, that's not something you'll know until you try to upload it and it tells you you can't. So just something to be aware of is maybe familiarizing yourself with Adobe so that you know how to upload a reduced size PDF or compress any documents that you need. Another thing with the document upload is that some prompts allow you to upload tons of documents in one spot, and others will prompt you to upload everything separately. So an example of this is showing positive net profit in the form of tax returns. You'll have to upload 2 years of tax returns. Those you'll have to combine into one PDF. So we recommend doing that in Adobe, either including slip sheets or something explaining that this is 1 year, this is another year. We're just uploading both of them together, whichever your preference is. But then when you're showing proof of residency, you can upload as many of the prompted items as you want, and you'll upload each of those separately. So that's something where you can keep them all as their separate files, keep some of them as JPEGs, some as PDFs, whatever format they come in, just go ahead and upload those individually. As I mentioned earlier with that application mockup, there are a ton of tips included in there. Some of those also carry over into the actual application itself. We highly, highly recommend reading those. A lot of them will answer some frequently asked questions. They'll provide some clarification, and just generally it's good practice to familiarize yourself with what they're actually looking for through those tips. You will also have the option to autofill your contact info, so be sure to double check that everything is correct. Also, as you're going through the portal for this application type, you'll see at the top, it'll list the true parties of interest, their names and their addresses over and over again. So I recommend looking at those just every time and making sure that you have no spelling errors, the zip code is correct, anything like that, just kind of really drilling it home that it is correct. And then at the end, there's another final review page. We highly recommend reviewing it very carefully, maybe putting another set of eyes on it if you've been looking at the portal all day, just to double check that everything is correct. We also recommend that you save this review page so that you have a record of what you submitted to the state on in your belongings. It's very helpful if you run into issues later down the road, you're not sure what you uploaded, you get a request for more information, you want to see what you've already provided. Just good practice to keep that on hand so you have it in your back pocket in case you ever need it. All right, and I'm going to hand it over to Casey for some compliance.
All right. So as Bridget and Tim spoke about the application process, what happens after really is where I kind of come into play and want to provide some insight. A lot of what I'm going to say is based on guidance documents and also anticipating mirroring some of the conditional adult use cultivation process. This is going to be slightly different because a design professional is responsible for the design of the cannabis dispensaries. So there is going to be some variance, but I just want to go over generally what you should expect in things that, from a compliance standpoint, you want to really wrap your mind around right from the beginning. So at some point, and according to the current guidance that is available, licensees will be given a period of time, if we mirror the cultivation, that's around 30 days, to finalize plans and documentations for the dispensaries. And that is also in the time frame where the actual location for the dispensary will be determined. Additionally, you'll also be asked to submit additional information and update the TPI. So one of those documents, again, if following the cultivation, would be the site plan. And you will also be responsible for submitting the security and staff plan that details risk mitigation and accident prevention plans. That really culminates in the risk assessment stages for each process in the dispensary. It's largely going to be, again, around receiving marijuana, storing it overnight, proper storage prior to dispensing, and displays. We're going to go into greater detail about the security requirements as well. So the dispensaries generally will be designed in space between 3,000 and 5,000 square feet, which is a pretty good size dispensary. The site plan is required to include a sales area and back of house. So the sales area will include reception area, a check-in area. Now, the check-in area and reception can actually be combined into one. If you're familiar with dispensaries, that's pretty common, where you've got almost like an entry vestibule where the initial ID verification may take place, kind of greeter, you'd have your education materials, kind of explain the process to adult use consumers as they enter the dispensary. Then there's also the open sales floor and display area. What's interesting is, they actually go into great detail about the sales area and specifically talk about how, they recommend clear product displays and smaller areas for visitors to meet staff for personalized experience. Doesn't explicitly require, to our knowledge and as of now, any sort of a private consultation area like you see in medical. They do want the shelving in the dispensary to clearly display products, and the use of fob locks, touchpads, and key codes have to be installed on display shelving. So as you're kind of aesthetically imagining this, these are things to consider. You'll also have the open sales floor and display area. Just kind of went over the displays. A branding wall, and that's really where your creativity in this 30-day consideration, you can start thinking about this, as soon as you even apply, like what is this branding wall really going to look like? And then there's also the sales counter and service space, which will be approximately 5 to 10 point of sale areas or kiosks. Typically what you're going to have there too is one ADA counter at least. So depending on the size and what the format's going to be, you're looking at 5 to 10 point of sales. There's also the back of house, which again, contemplates a sally port. Depending on where they're located, this may look different. We expect, there to be some municipal restrictions, some general building restrictions that aren't going to allow for like the traditional drive-in sally port, but they'll have to work with the licensees and regulators to kind of figure out what is acceptable to meet that requirement. Now, there's also going to be a cannabis processing workroom, vault and secure storage area, office space, general storage, restrooms, janitor's closets, electrical data security closet, mechanical room if necessary, and a break room. Now, they do talk about circulation from back of house areas to the sales area, have to be shielded from customer view to the extent possible, which, as the designers are working to figure this out, you can imagine could mean one of two things. It could mean that, there's a runner that takes product from behind like a fulfillment area or point of sale area and fills up any sort of storage directly there. The bud tender would be filling it there, or this may allow for some type of fulfillment or pass through. Those specs will kind of be flushed out in greater detail as the regs develop. Now, the vault door also has to be shielded from customer view. That's pretty standard in many states, but that is explicitly called out. Now, some of the other things you want to consider, like I mentioned, was this branding wall. Now, the branding wall gets completed by the licensee. This is not something that the design team is going to, take care of really for you. To the extent, though, there is also, your ability to kind of, with this branding wall, include things like, some people have, wood paneling on their branding wall. That may be something that you'll work with the designer to handle. But this is a dedicated wall space in a prominent interior location that may include themes via paint, wall covering, like I mentioned, or a decorative wall feature. And this is really the opportunity for you to highlight products or brands. So, if this was me going through this license and, my creative mind would want to go there and really start thinking about this branding wall. And building signage, interior and exterior building signage may include, post and panel signage, room identification, panel signage, and dimensional letter signage. Signage package will include foundations and power for the post panel signage and the power attachment design for lighted dimensional letter signage. And building signage will actually be tied to the retail branding. Of course, there's going to be some restrictions based on the regulations, or at least, as they are currently drafted. The comment period recently closed, but we don't really expect there to be, major overhaul. Of course, there could be, but as of right now, that comment period just closed, so to be determined. But as of now, your brand cannot include medical symbols. When you're thinking about this branding wall, you want to remember that the way the regulations are drafted right now, nothing can be attractive to minors. So that includes any bubble type or cartoon-like font or any bright colors that are neon in appearance. So you want to make sure you're taking a close look at what those regulations are prior to working on a design team for this branding wall. Signage, right? The exterior building signage, also consider what is currently in the regulations. There are a lot of restrictions on what the outdoor signage can be, and this is just what's written in the regs. There's probably going to be some municipal restrictions as well. So when we go into the security requirements, this is just, as you think about drafting these plans, which are going to have to be submitted at some point, you got to be aware of what's required, right? So alarms, including backup alarm system, motion detectors, video cameras that record 24/7 with the ability to produce a still color photo with the date and time stamp embedded right in it. So what does that mean for you? Things like having a color printer to evidence that you can do this. Duress, panic, and hold up alarms at the sales counter, typically every other point of sale and reach of every bud tender. Glass break sensors, those kind of go hand in hand with the motion detectors, but obviously if you don't have glass windows, not applicable. Automatic voice dialer or digital dialer, a failure notification system. These are all pretty standard, in any dispensary security system. Ability to remain operational during a power outage. Now that's very explicit, where in other states' regulations, they may say ability to remain operational during a power outage for 4 hours. This is a blanket ability to remain operational during a power outage. Maintenance of all security equipment recordings and a secure location. Perimeter around the facility must be illuminated, and you have to have a door with pinless hinges. Again, this will all be contemplated typically by that designer as well, and secure network access, of course. So as of right now, there's actually this is from the RFP guidance for point of sale software. These are things you want to familiarize yourself with because, because you want to be operational and get going right away, having a general understanding of what the point of sale requirements are and what their functionality is going to be is super important. So user roles will be based on user role access control. So think about it like, a bud tender would have certain access to the point of sale system versus somebody in fulfillment versus a manager that's got to monitor first in, first out, inventory control, those roles. Strong password policy, maintenance of detailed activity logs for an audit trail of changes to the data. Now, our understanding is that this point of sale system will obviously integrate with whatever the state's system is. It may be Metric, BioTrack, whatever it is, but the intention is there's an integration there. In a web application compatible with current versions of Chrome, obviously. Redundancy should be provided to minimize planned and unplanned downtime, controls for business continuity and data loss prevention. Sandbox environments, that's, really for training implementation. That's, before you have any products, right? You're going to want to be able to practice on there and teach your staff without actually moving any inventory. Now, this is again similar if they track similar to the cultivation licenses during the second phase of the application, you'll be receiving notification from the OCM that the following information is going to be required. Now, with the cultivation license, there's also a request for an operating plan. So you can pretty much prepare yourself for something very similar. General SOPs, how is this facility going to function, who has access to what areas, really demonstrate that you understand the operations and compliant ones. So what do we know, right? We know that after your application is going to be submitted, guidance explicitly says that you'll need to update the TPI, a staff list, certificate of occupancy, financial statements, vendor agreements. So that's anything from, third-party providers, waste management, cash transportation, workers' compensation insurance, paid family leave insurance, unemployment insurance, certificate of authority from the New York State Department of Tax and Finance, certificate of incorporation or application of authority from the New York State Department, labor peace agreement, business continuity plan, similar probably to that operations, and fingerprints to obtain your criminal justice history. What's good about this point of sale system and some of the requirements in this RFP is specifically contemplated the compliance component, which obviously is important to me. It has to configure, again, and have the ability to transfer all required data on a real-time basis to the state seed to sale tracking system. This, isn't further defined. It may mean real-time, which could be at the end of the day, but the intention is that it does integrate and provides an immediate push to the state seed to sale tracking system. As history goes, these aren't perfect, they aren't flawless, and typically there is a way to kind of override and do a physical upload should that system not work perfectly. Now, data submitted to the seed to sale tracking system will be related to product inventory, transaction data, tax collection. Again, pretty standard, but just know that that point of sale system that is picked will have those capabilities for you. Similarly, what you're going to see is the data reporting, which includes, what is sold, the quantity of products sold, inventory currently at the dispensary, selling price, tax due, method of payment, employee completed in the sales transaction, which is really important, especially when you're thinking about ongoing compliance, because if there's ever inventory discrepancies or worst case scenario, some type of indication of diversion, you're able to go back and watch, what the transactions were that day. If there's anything irregular, that's a great way to view what's going on there. Device used to complete a sales transaction, cashless ATM, cash, anything like that would be indicated there. Unique identifier for the sales transaction. That again, will be the batch number or barcode associated with the individual item, date and time of sale, any returns made by consumers, and transactions between the retail dispensary and the distributor. So that's going to also track what is incoming from other licensees. And as referenced, the hardware that's going to be provided by the designers, when when the dispensary is built out, are the point of sale terminals, receipt printers, barcode scanners, cash drawers, basically, the full set there. And now the transaction module will include the ability to scan the customer's ID right from the point of sale, to verify age and add the customer to the queue. It's a great feature for anybody who has used something like that before in other states. Check-in features to capture and track the customer, digital payments, cashless ATMs, and other apps. There'll be an e-commerce platform, including an online menu and online ordering with a built-in product library that's really easy to fill based on your current inventory. And it's going to fully integrate with the point of sale system and your website. Now, one of the things I had brushed over before was really these advertising restrictions. Now, again, comment period just closed. It could change, but as of right now, these are some of the highlights that you should be thinking about. And the way the advertising regs are written right now, they're pretty strict. They're really focused on being attractive to minors. And what's great about them is they really do describe what is attractive to minors. But for signage in particular, something you're definitely going to want to consider. Again, you can't advertise any brand on the exterior or interior of the premises. Advertising is prohibited on signs and placards in arenas, stadiums, shopping malls, fairs that receive state allocations, and video game arcades also. Wayfaring signage is limited to the business or trade name, the location, and the nature of the business. It has to be affixed to a building or permanent structure, limited to 1,600 square inches, cannot be illuminated by neon lights, can't be on a vehicle, and not more than 2 per licensee. It also cannot depict cannabis products, or imagery or action of smoking or vaping. What's interesting on the advertising is the advertising warnings. They actually need to go in a specific yellow box, and there's also rotating warnings. So if you mass print out a bunch of advertisements, you may want to slow that down or plan to kind of cut that back a little bit, because there are rotating warnings, and they may be at a set frequency or maybe at their discretion to change that warning. And audience data. When you think about advertising, one of the big considerations is, do you have the audience data? In New York, the way they're currently contemplated is 90% of the audience needs to be 21 plus. Obtaining that data, depending on what the venue is easy, because it's something typical. It's for any business, for any marketing platform. This is something they have, but it may not be. Where billboards as of right now are not permitted, those are, billboard companies have this audience data, usually right at the tip of their fingers, might not be quite as common for other mediums. Now, other ongoing compliance considerations is pricing. The price of each product, this is interesting, right? Must be displayed immediately adjacent to the items displayed in the interior of the licensed premises. So it's making very clear, should you have, a display with a particular edible, maybe it's just the box completely empty, you want to have be prepared for immediately adjacent to the item, the price. Exit packaging can be branded. So again, when you're thinking about designing your branding or what you can control and plan for at this point, exit packaging is a good one. And all products will arrive on site prepackaged. So what that means is no deli style, or you're not going to have the situations where you have bulk flour coming in and you're going to weigh that out in front of the customer. At least as of now, that is the way the requirements are reading. So that's pretty much the end of the ongoing compliance considerations. There's some resources up here on the slide for you. And I think we're going to go to some Q&A.
Thanks, Casey. I'll just kind of run through the questions that we have anyway. How far back for an arrest record is the state looking at? There's no real limitation in terms of how far back this goes, as long as it is a conviction under Penal Law 221 and it occurred before March 31st, 2021. Is the address on the official certificate of disposition sufficient to prove address at time of arrest? It may be used to prove address, but we really kind of emphasize that people should include as much supporting documentation as they can in order to evidence their address at the time of arrest and conviction. Is there an amount of cannabis the state is looking for that exceeds a certain limit? There is not an amount. It doesn't matter as long as it's a conviction under Penal Law 221. You have to be married at the time of the conviction. You do not have to have necessarily been married at the time of conviction. Does the submission of the application affect the approval process? So based on what we're hearing, it's not going to impact the approval process as long as you've submitted by September 26th and you respond to any RFIs within 30 days. We still encourage people to kind of submit sooner rather than later, like as soon as they possibly can, because we don't have an official standpoint in writing really at this point on that. Okay. Regulators state that passive investors are not TPIs. Its definitions seem to only consider passive investors as those who are investors in publicly traded companies. Is that correct? A passive investor cannot be a member of an LLC who has an interest but no voting rights. So Bridgette, you might have to offer some color here, but based upon the TPI forms and passive, it seems like passive investors are TPIs regardless of the voting rights, and we think it'll get narrowed over time, but for now it looks like the only exemption is for publicly traded companies. Bridgette, do you have anything to add on that point?
Just on the point of TPIs in general, I highly recommend that if you think someone is a TPI, then they should definitely complete the TPI disclosure form and the tax clearance form. Whether or not you put it into the portal, I think you could always reach out to OCM for clarity on whether that person is a TPI. And it's always better to have those materials prepared in case you need them.
Thanks, Bridgette. Can operators customize the decor of their CAURD dispensary, or equity operators being denied the autonomy to have their store actually look like their vision for it? Casey, I think you can kind of speak to this a little bit anyway.
Yeah, that's not at this time. We do believe that that's going to be there's going to be some consultation between the design team and the licensee, but is not explicit in the RFP or any guidance that I've seen. Bridgette, have you seen anything with guidance specific to that communication between the two?
No, unfortunately, I haven't seen anything specifically addressing decor yet. I'm sure it'll come in time though.
Like a lot of these things, some of this stuff is, hasn't been finalized yet. So we're really going on what we have. And I did see a few of the questions regarding where a lot of this information is coming from regarding, the building specs and the point of sale. They're actually coming from the RFPs. And what we can do is we can link you to those RFPs. You can see the RFP for the point of sale system and the RFP for the design requirements. So I think that will give you some insight of where these lists and some of the information I've got should provide some insight that way. And I did notice there was another question too about which entity is providing the point of sale hardware. It's our understanding, based on the way the RFP is drafted, that is actually a part of what the design team will be providing. And based on the fact that the point of sale providers also being chosen via an RFP, they would implement those programs that way.
I had a question about, are federal convictions applicable or marijuana convictions in states other than New York? It has to be a conviction in the state of New York. Okay.
You want me to take the next one on the flower displays?
Yeah, there's a few of these. Yeah,
that's unfortunately not something that's been clarified yet. With the advertising regs, I kind of thought that that would be addressed, but it's really something that needs to be drilled down in the storage. When they talk about displays in the RFP, they talk about locking them up, which to me insinuates that there would be live displays, but again, unfortunately, we don't have an explicit answer at this time.
Thanks, Casey. And we kind of answered some of these, or as far as like where the information came from, the RFP and that kind of thing. Any update on when the next round of applications will be released? Bridgette, do you have any insight there if you'd like to kind of chime in?
Honestly, it's all speculative at this point in time. I know that OCM is pushing to open general licenses shortly after these conditional licenses are issued. So I would expect to see general licensing maybe in spring of 2023, but that's very speculative based on just the tempo that they've been moving at. But OCM has said that regulations for other priority groups will be released by the end of this year. So those retailer apps will likely go live at the early end of next year. So that's something else to look forward to.
I can take the question here regarding what is attractive or appeals to minors. In the current version of the advertising regulations, there is some reference and some definitions of attractive to minors that I would suggest taking a look at. Let me just pull those for you and just hit the highlights real quick on those. But really, they do a better job, I think, than some other states that, you know, it's really subjective, right? What is attractive to minors? But they do talk about neon colors, cartoons, things that, you know, really give you a little bit more clarification regarding, you know, using whether like individuals, like somebody like the most interesting man in the world who targets, you know, an alcohol brand, you know, that at this time, we don't know necessarily how these comments on the advertising regulations are going to shake out. Once we have final ones, we'll definitely be able to get some more clarity, hopefully, on what that's going to look like. See if I can answer another one on here. I will get those RFPs too, so you can take a look where some of that information is coming from as well. Bridgette, do you know the answer about the number of licensees allocated per region?
Yep. So
Okay.
that is in some guidance from OCM. I can drop the link to that in the chat as well. But there's 150 licenses. They're distributed throughout the state in the regions that you'll be ranking. So I could pop the chart in the chat.
And then as far as, you know, are the priority groups and like what the licensing will look like, OCM said the regs for those other priority groups will be released by the end of this year. So you'll probably be seeing those retailer applications early next year. You know, obviously that's kind of touch and go at this point, but that's what we're looking at in terms of timeline. Yeah, and to kind of reiterate the passive investor and TPI disclosures, there's kind of a conflict on this topic right now. We would kind of want to advise people to take a conservative approach in terms of disclosures on that point. And we do agree that it is, inconsistent in terms of language in the regs, on the forms, and the application. So not abundantly clear. Best to be conservative.
For the person in the chat, going through the card application right now, and we keep typing our qualifying business location and trying to save it, but it won't save. It's possible that the address that you've been putting in is not verified. So you'll be prompted to verify the address, and that's the only address that it will actually let you save in the portal. And on the question about how applications will be scored, is there any sort of scoring rubric? On OCM's website, under Conditional Adult Use Retailer, there's those resources. There's some scoring and selection guidance. I highly recommend taking a look at that to get a better insight as to what OCM is looking for and what they'll be considering.
Yeah, and the emphasis there will be on the eligibility criteria. So, proving the conviction, your past business experience, like so on and so forth. So submitting as much detail you can in support of that will go a long way in terms of the scoring criteria, we think.
Regarding the sites, the question about the sites, I don't know, Bridgette, if you have any insight on if it's true that they don't have any sites yet, but I can tell you with like the 30, 60, 90-day periods, that 30, 60, 90 day is based on what the cultivation licensees had to submit by. And again, this is a little bit of a different circumstance. They're going to have to take into consideration that you can't really hand over a site plan until the site's been determined, and there's a floor plan, and the architect draws everything up, make sure everything's approved. So there will be some consideration and probably some pivoting on what those timeframes for the licensee and those obligations are going to look like based on how long these construction timelines and, again, siting is going to take.
Yeah, and we have heard that a handful of leases have been signed and are ready to go. We don't know where those locations are, but we do know that OCM is actively negotiating leases in other areas. And I expect that by the time that they're actually seeking to hand out these sites, they will have them signed and ready to go.
We also have a question about maintaining eligibility for the CAURD license. And so, although the first renewal is due 2 years after provisional licensure, you're required to maintain your CAURD eligibility for 4 years, and unless otherwise noted by the OCM. And so you need to maintain your status as long as you have the CAURD license, basically. Eventually, there will be a process according to which they'll be able to transition that to just a regular adult use without the conditional components of it. But for now, you have to maintain that for 4 years.
On the question about are non-New York residents required to fill out the New York tax forms, yes. If they are TPI, they do need to fill out that tax disclosure form, regardless of their residency.
Okay, I think that kind of answers at least the vast majority of the questions we've gotten. Some of them were duplicative, but we appreciate your time. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us. We'll try our best to answer any supplemental questions you might have. And thank you again.